Welcome to this presentation by the National Research Mentoring Network in partnership with Columbia University Medical Center. We are proud to welcome Dr. Jaime Rubin, who will be presenting about NIH individual pre-doctoral fellowships. Specifically, this webinar will be discussing the best practices for effective grantsmanship, different approaches to submitting competitive applications, common mistakes that junior investigators make when approaching this, and some tips to increase your success for submitting your application. Dr. Rubin will be focusing on individual graduate pre-doctoral fellowship funding mechanisms, as well as content that you should include when completing the key required components of this application. And so without further ado, I will pass this along to Dr. Rubin, and thank you so much. Before you begin, I just want to mention that we will be holding a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, at which time attendees, you will be able to click on the raise your hand button that you notice in the GoToWebinar pane to be called upon to be unmuted for questions. So we will be holding that at the end, and please hold any questions you have until that time.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all the attendees. I'd like to thank the National Research Mentoring Network for inviting me to participate in this, and thank you for everybody joining us today. So as you can see from my first slide, I think it's always important, as with any grant application, is to start with an outline and to give yourself an idea of what items to be covered. So these are the four main items that I'm going to be covering today. The overview of the fellowship funding mechanism, an overview of the grant review process, because it's very important in terms of increasing the competitiveness of your grant application to understand how the grant is reviewed at NIH, and then what are the different key components of a fellowship application, and then general approaches for any grant application in terms of making it more competitive, highlighting specific aspects of the fellowship application. So I'll start at the top in terms of an overview of the fellowship. So one of the things to mention is nationally, a lot of thought leaders and government agencies and leadership are looking at the support of graduate students and what are the best ways to support graduate students. As some of you may know, a lot of graduate students are supported not through individual fellowships, but through their mentors' research grants. And there's now sort of a general feeling that maybe we should get away from this funding mechanism and work more towards funding individual students and their mentors and their individual research projects through this individual fellowship mechanism. So I think this mechanism will grow in importance in the coming years. And this is an example of a recent paper that was published in PNAS that addressed this issue. Another publication that came out looking at the support of graduate students as well as postdocs was a very large paper by the advisory committee to the director of NIH, which looked at biomedical workforce issues. And they looked at different aspects of the funding of graduate students and to how to make their graduate experience more effective. So in terms of the individual National Research Service Award Individual Pre-Doc Fellowship, which in NIH speak is called the F31, and how it differs from other funding mechanisms is that it supports a particular individual, a particular graduate student, and it provides a stipend, compensation for the student, health fees, the student's tuition, or a portion of the tuition, and travel to a national conference to allow the student to present their research results, network with other scientists, begin to form collaborations with their peers, and hear other people's work. One of the things you'll notice that is not funded by the fellowship is research costs. There's no money for reagents, animal costs, or whatever. It's expected that the mentor has extramural research support that will cover the research costs that the student will need for their dissertation research. And what are the four main criteria that reviewers use when reviewing these grant applications? One is the individual graduate student and a feeling that this student will continue to be a success in academic research. That the mentor is appropriate, and we'll get into the details of this in terms of providing the correct scientific environment, helping to launch the student onto the next stage of their research career and so forth. And we'll go into more detail. And that the research project is interesting, exciting, and being approached in the appropriate way. And the institutional environment, both research-wise, does the institution have core facilities and so forth that the student will need, as well as career development opportunities, going to meetings, workshops on grantsmanship or how to give presentations, those kinds of things. Just to give you an idea of the competitiveness of this funding program, this is a graph from NIH. It's their most current graph of the success rate of the F31, pre-doc fellowship. The green is the number of awards, the blue is the number of applications, and the red is the success rate, which is really just the number of awards divided by the number of applications. So you can see that the success rate is in the mid 20% or so, 25%. So this is a chart of NIH's different funding mechanisms and what are the deadlines. So to realize that the F series, and for graduate students it would be the F31, there are 3 deadlines a year, and this is very sort of unusual in the funding world. Most funding agencies have 1, maybe 2 deadlines per year, and NIH has 3 funding cycles. There are 2 types of F31 fellowships. One is the F31 Diversity Fellowship, which has a deadline date of April 13th, August 13th, and December 13th. And the other F31, April 8th, August 8th, and December 8th. And it's very important to remember these deadlines. And so how long does it take from when you apply to when you get funded? So sorry, if we go back and look at this sort of light bluish green cycle 1, if you apply, let's say, on April 13th, your grant will be reviewed in June or July. It will then go to the NIH's Council for final decision, August through October. And then perhaps you'll be funded sometime in September to December. So it really is a 9-month process from application to award, if you will. You apply, then there's the review committee, then there's the Institute's council agreeing with what the review committee says, and then an award about 3 months later. It's a very long process. So this is sort of what the first page of the funding announcement looks like. National Research Service Award, Individual Pre-Doc Fellowship to promote diversity in health-related research. And here you can see a list of all the different institutes at NIH that support, that fund this funding mechanism. There's a National Cancer Institute, National Eye Institute, and so forth. They're listed in alphabetical order, meaning that all of these institutes will accept applications for the F31 program. And in terms of the diversity F31, this slide here shows what NIH says that they're looking for that would, in terms of eligibility criteria for the F31. And this would be for individuals from racial and ethnic groups that have been shown to be underrepresented in health-related science and research. Many times you'll see that they refer to the National Science Foundation, which is a completely different agency, but they sort of keep these sort of demographic records. And the second category, that was category A, and the second category is individuals with disabilities who are defined as those with physical or mental impairment that substantially limit one or more major life activities. Somebody who doesn't meet these criteria for the diversity F31 are welcome to apply for the other F31 program. Has exactly the same review criteria. The application is exactly the same deadlines. The application kit is exactly the same. It's just a question of meeting this eligibility criteria. All right, so what is the NIH Fellowship Grant Review process? So one of the things is to understand what NIH looks at, and it's the National Institutes of Health. There's an S at the end of institute. So there's the National Cancer Institute. You'll see that many of these are really focused on different disease areas. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And then at the bottom of the slide, you'll see the Center for Scientific Review. And I've circled that because I wanted to highlight to you that one of the things that many people don't realize is that while the National Cancer Institute might accept the grant application, might fund the grant, the award, it is in fact not reviewed at the National Cancer Institute. The grant is in fact reviewed at a completely separate entity within NIH called the Center for Scientific Review. And it's very critical when you apply to make sure that your grant ends up at the correct review panel or study section, as some folks call it, that your grant end up at the correct study section for its review. If the grant ends up at the wrong review panel within the Center for Scientific Review, those reviewers will not have the appropriate expertise to review your grant, and there's a very good chance that you won't get a great score just because they don't understand what wonderful things you're proposing. So this is another slide just representing how the Center for Scientific Review, or CSR, receives your grant, reviews your grant, and then sends it out to the different institutes for funding, National Cancer Institute, National Nursing Research, so forth. This is a picture of a review panel, and one of the reasons I like to show it is remember that there are sort of human beings at the other end that are going to review your grant. It's a very sort of impersonal grant review or grant submission process is all done electronically, but remember that there's a panel with human beings at the other end that are giving of their time basically voluntarily to review your grant. The reviewers are peer reviewers from across the country, faculty at research institutions across the country. They are not employees of NIH. While employees of NIH might manage the process, they don't offer a score. There's peer reviewers from across the country that come of their own time to review the grants. And this is just a listing of all of the different study sections. And hopefully your grant will end up in the appropriate study section. You'll see that the study sections begin with their numerical ID, begins with the letter F, meaning that they're for fellowships. And there's F01A, F01B, and so forth, all the way through to F17. This is a listing of the fellowship committees that one can find on the web. And one can continue to get information as one drills down to make sure that this is the right study section for you. So for instance, if we looked at F13, which is for infectious diseases and microbiology, it will give you 2 or 3 sentences overview on the research areas that are seen by this study section. And so you can have an initial idea whether this is the right study section for you or not. But I think you should continue to explore this because it is so critical that your grant end up in the right study section. Many times that could be the deciding factor on whether your grant gets reviewed properly or not. And in fact, one can even go further and get a listing of who are the members of the study section. You are not allowed to contact, nor should you contact, any of the peer reviewers who are members of the study section. But because this is a public agency funded by taxpayer funds, because of transparency, it is up on the web who are all the members of the study section. And you or your mentor or advisors should recognize one or more of the names on the study section. That tells you that you're probably in the right place. If you don't recognize anybody listed, then perhaps, not definitely, but perhaps this is not the right study section. So it would be good to review the membership of the study section with your mentors or advisors to see if they recognize any of the names as being their colleagues, and then most likely it's the right study section for you. If it's not, NIH also gives you a list of other study sections that have similar research areas of interest. One can even go further. Some of you might be familiar with NIH Reporter. This is the online grants database for all of NIH's funded grants. It's an incredibly powerful database with a lot of usability, and you can learn a lot of information. So as an example here, if you look at the bottom right around the red box, you'll see that I selected the F13 study section that we were just discussing, and then I hit enter, and what came out was a listing of 145 different fellowships that were reviewed successfully by this study section. This database, NIH Reporter, is only for funded awards. It's not the unsuccessful applications. It's only for the successful applications. So here you'll see a mix of F31 for pre-docs and F32s for postdocs. But this will give you an idea of the grants that were successfully reviewed by this study section, and you can get an idea whether what you're proposing, your research areas, fall within similar research areas. If all of the research titles, and if you click the research title, it'll bring you to abstracts, really look like areas of research unrelated to what you're proposing, then this is probably not the right study section for you. You should do all of this research before you apply. And why should you do all this research before you apply is because now within the application there's a form, an optional form, not required, where you can request a specific study section. So you need to do that within the application. You can't apply, find out where your grant ended up and say, oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong spot. Can you move me? It needs to be done as part of the grant application process. This is the form, and I've highlighted a couple of the different sections. One is the awarding component. So that would be, please send my grant to the National Cancer Institute. Please send my grant to the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, if you will. But what we've been discussing is that second section, the study section, assignment request. And that was where you would list F13, F8, F1, whatever it is. The second page of the form even includes an area, identify specific areas of expertise. Well, the study sections are large. They can have members, as you can see, of about maybe 24 individuals. So they have a wide range of expertise. You can drill down even further, and discussing this with your mentors, pick up to 5 different areas of research, areas of expertise, if you will, that you are requesting that the reviewers have so that they can adequately review your grant application. And this is to make sure that your grant ends up in the right place and in the right hands, all of which will increase your chances for success. Second section in the grant review process is to understand the scoring system, which NIH calls impact scores. And the impact scores are from 1 to 9. They're whole integers. Usually I would say that the successful grants get in the range of 1 to 3 or so. And the final impact score that you receive will be the mean of all of the reviewer scores times 10, which means that, let's say there are 20 people on the review committee, and these 20 people give a range of either 2.0 or 3.0, 2s or 3s, remembering that it's whole integers. They will then calculate what the mean is. Let's say what the mean is 2.2 multiplied by 10, then your final overall impact score is 22, which is a pretty good score. Basically, this perhaps is kind of obvious, but what determines finally which grants are funded? The scientific merit, the programmatic considerations of the institute and what they're interested in funding, and of course, how much money there is. And what are the fellowship review criteria? This is also a very important section because part of grantsmanship and learning to write grants is to write the grants addressing what the review criteria are. The reviewers are looking for specific points, and so it's beholden on the grant writer to then make sure that they more than adequately address the individual review criteria. This is your overall impact score that we just discussed. And what are the things that they're looking for? That there's an integration between the research project and the training plan, and that it's the right environment, and having this fellowship and being in this mentor's lab really will launch the individual onto a successful and independent research career. And this is the form that the reviewers will fill out. Bullet points of strengths and weaknesses in these 5 areas. The fellowship applicant, the sponsor, where it's some institutions you might call it the mentor or the advisor, and your collaborators and co-investigators, the research training plan, what you're proposing to do, the training potential of you and the institution and the environment where you're doing your graduate studies or your dissertation research. And then I've sort of cut and pasted what the review criteria are in each of these sections because I think it's important to see what the reviewers see and not to paraphrase what the review criteria are. But I've highlighted and underlined what I think are some of the key points in each of the sections. In terms of the applicant, what is their academic record? Have they had previous research experience, perhaps an undergraduate? Convincing the reviewers that you have the potential to succeed in a productive research career. Do you have a commitment to that research career? These are the things to get across in the application, okay? What about the mentors or the advisors or the sponsors and your collaborators and your co-investigators? What is their research qualifications? What's their track record of mentoring individuals like you at your career stage? Do you have overlapping research interests? Is there a match? Does the mentor understand this very junior investigator's need for mentoring and training? And what is the mentor's commitment to meeting those mentoring requirements, if you will? Okay, does the mentor, we mentioned this a little bit before, have adequate research funds? Do they have money to support your research expenses? If you have more than one mentor, and you're sort of being mentored by a team, does it make sense? What are the roles of the different members of the team? It has to really make sense. And who are the co-investigators and the collaborators? What do they bring to this project? What is their background? And the research training plan, of course, it has to be great science, asking and answering an important question, and it has to be well integrated in the training plan. And it has to be, I think the bottom two bullets are very important. It has to be consistent with this stage of a research career. It has to be appropriate for a student. It can't be appropriate for a postdoc or a junior faculty member. The project has to be appropriate for a student, and the time course has to be appropriate for a student. A student wants to graduate. It can't be a project that will take 8 years to finish. So the project has to be appropriate for a student in terms of the type of project and what's involved, as well as how long it will take to complete the project. And what will you learn in this research project? Will you gain new and exciting, appropriate research skills and experiences? What gaps need to be filled? What do you need to learn? Do you need to learn more techniques? Do you need to learn some bench research? Do you need to learn statistics and so forth? And are those things addressed? So to recognize what the students need for their career development and how the training plan and potential will address those needs. Will you learn to give presentations? Will you learn how to network? Will you learn more about writing grants so that you will develop the skill set for the next stage of your career and hopefully a future career as an independent scientist? Okay, is this the right place for you to do this project? Do they have that right specialized piece of equipment, or the animal facilities, or the other core facilities? Is there somebody to help with imaging or statistics and those kinds of things? What is the institution's commitment to this particular research project and to their graduate program as a whole? So the environment for doing the project is very important. So what are the different components of the fellowship application? There's new forms, Forms D, that was released early this year. Make sure that you're not using one of the earlier versions, that you're using Forms D, as in dog. Make sure you take into account all the different page limitations. Each of these sections have specific page limitations. For instance, the specific aims page is 1. The application will not go through the electronic submission process if you're over the page limit. So be very cognizant of these required page limits. So this is sort of what the main body of the grant looks like. And as you can see, there are different items, specific aims, research strategy, and so forth. And basically what you do is you write your document in Word, convert to PDF, and then you add that attachment. The final document that's added to this form, if you will, must be in PDF. Otherwise, the grant will not be electronically submitted. So we're going to go through these main components. The first thing is to realize is that you don't submit the introduction. That is to be used for the second submission if you didn't get funded the first time, where you would address the reviewer's comments. You don't do the renewal because there's no renewal of a F31. So automatically I've eliminated 2 of the sections. So one of the most important sections is the fellowship section, fellowship applicant section, and this is where you literally sort of talk about yourself and your background in research and what your career aspirations are. So you would talk about any other research experiences you had, maybe as an undergraduate, maybe you rotated through different faculty's labs in your first year of graduate school, and then a preliminary description of your doctoral thesis. And then what are your career goals? What are your career aspirations? And then how will this fellowship, how will this training program help you reach those goals? And be specific. Discuss specific skills that you're lacking or other things that you want to learn or conceptual approaches. What do you need to help you to move on to the next stage and to be an independent scientist? And what will you do during this period of training? How will this fellowship help you reach those goals? So for instance, maybe you're at the point where, let's say you've taken all your required courses, but then you realize you need to learn statistics, so you need to learn more about imaging, or you need to learn career development skills about, let's say, writing journal articles or giving oral presentations. You would include this as part of the different skill sets that you will learn during the course of the fellowship, and facilitating your transition to the next career stage. So also you should begin to become more independent, because certainly a postdoc is more independent than a graduate student. And so as your graduate career progresses, you should become more independent. And then be specific about what activities you're going to do year by year in the fellowship. Are there any specific courses you're going to go to, or workshops? What meetings or conferences do you hope to attend and present? Be specific about what the activities are. Do you have any teaching responsibilities? Are you going to mentor anybody, let's say a high school student that's in the lab for the summer or something like that? Be specific. And then create a timeline for this activity. So usually it makes sense to take courses at the very beginning and not at the end. If you need to use statistics, then it would make sense, let's say, to take a course in statistics in the first year of the fellowship and not at the last year. Now this next section, number 3 and number 4, specific aims and research strategy, this is the part that you should work on very closely with your mentor, because this is the more technical section of the grant. I will say that the specific aims are 1 page, and this is sort of a general bullet point outline of what's good to approach, how to approach the specific aims. It can only be 1 page. It's always good to clearly state what the hypothesis of your project is. The hypothesis of my project is. The reviewers will look for that statement, so it's best not to have it buried someplace on that page. Clearly describe what are the goals of the project and how you're going to meet those goals, and also the impact of your research on the field, why it's important. If you look a little bit down the 3rd bullet from the bottom, the challenging an existing paradigm or clinical practice, what is new about what you're proposing? Why should it be done? The research strategy, there are defined sections, and you should work on this very closely with your mentor. You're allowed 6 pages total. The significance of the project, right? Why is it important? How will the field change? What is missing or not understood right now in the field, and how will your work address those issues? You don't do section B, innovation, but section C, the approach. All right, how are you going to answer the questions that you've posed? And I would mention not only what kind of data are you going to collect and how are you going to analyze it, but also to address potential problems or challenges that you might meet, technically or otherwise, and then how will you address those problems. It shows a lot of maturity on your part if you recognize that there are particular challenges that could come up during, let's say, the 3 or 4 years of the fellowship and how you would address it. Some folks will use the phrase alternate strategies. And then what are your benchmarks or milestones for success, or how will you know that you're progressing? What are you looking for? What are your benchmarks and milestones? Another aspect that is becoming more and more important for NIH grant applications is rigor and reproducibility, sort of the statistical design of the study and the statistical analysis of the results. And if you look at the second bullet from the bottom, preliminary studies or results. This is very important and would strengthen any grant application. It addresses feasibility. By saying that you've already done some of the work, it sort of shows to the reviewers that the project A is doable and that you can do it. So it's not so hypothetical that the work can be done. In fact, you've demonstrated that the work can be done, and just importantly, that you can do the work. So respective contributions. This is where you would write down, it's only a page, about how you and your mentor developed the grant application. So it's not supposed to be that your mentor wrote the grant application or that you wrote it all and then showed it to the mentor the day before, but rather it was a collaborative and learning exercise for you, that you would write a draft and then discuss it with your mentor and how to improve it, what sections to include, and so forth, and then you would go back and write it. Selection of sponsor and institution. So you probably wrote something similar to this when you applied to graduate school. Why did you choose this mentor? Why did you choose this institution? And what exciting research is going on in that mentor's lab that drew you to that mentor's lab? And training in the responsible conduct of research. This has been a requirement for about almost 25 years, I would say now. And all institutions offer a course in the responsible conduct of research. And then you would describe that course in detail, the subjects that are covered, how often the course meets, who teaches the course, and so forth. This is a required component of the grant application. And Section 9 is where your sponsor or mentor, however you call it, sort of talks about, what they talk about is what they will do for you, in essence, or what their lab will do for you. It's not about them. It's not about their research project. It's really what they can do for you and your graduate training. Section A is, what financial support do they have to support your research? Do they have any other NIH grants and so forth? Because if you remember, I said that the F31 doesn't provide any money for research costs. So it's up to the mentor to be able to provide that. Their previous fellows, have they mentored previous students who've then gone on to be have successful careers in research? So they want to know how many pre-doc and post-doc fellows they previously mentored. And then talk about 5 of them and where are they now. So they really want to know that this individual not only has money to do research, but also would be a good mentor. So being a scientist and being a mentor are not always the same thing. Okay. Section C, the training plan, the environment, and research facilities. So what resources are going to be available for you during this fellowship? The technical facilities in terms of the core facilities and so forth. What do they plan for your professional development, for you to learn to give presentations, to write grants, to be a mentor yourself? And how will all of this help transition you to a more independent stage, the postdoc stage? How many other people, students or postdocs, are being mentored by the mentors the same time as you. So for instance, if there's 15 other students and postdocs in the lab at the same time as you, you're probably not going to get very close mentoring. And that's a concern to the reviewers, okay? And then finally, Section E, their review of your qualifications and potential for a research career. Letters of support from collaborators. All right, this is up to 6 pages. So this would be anybody else that's involved in your research, another advisor, another co-investigator, the director of a core facility that maybe is helping you out, a statistician that's helping you out, and so forth. And they would talk about their expertise and their role in the proposed research plan, up to 6 pages. And then the institutional environment and commitment to your training. And this is 2 pages, and it would just sort of be a description of the research environment that you're in. Are there journal clubs, seminars going on, appropriate facilities and resources, and so forth. Is a new requirement that's coming up is instruction in rigor and reproducibility. This, like responsible conduct of research, is now going to be a new requirement in the training of junior investigators at NIH-funded institutions. So what kind of resources, let's say your Office of Graduate Affairs or Student Affairs offers in support of graduate students? A relatively new requirement is this document additional educational information. So there was a feeling that graduate students were taking too long to graduate, and that the graduate programs perhaps were not keeping a key eye on them. So there is this other document which should be completed by the director of your graduate program, which asks about time to degree over the past 10 years for students in this particular graduate program. What kind of milestones do they have to sort of keep an eye on students? Their yearly committee meetings? When is their qualifying exam? How often does the program director meet with the graduate students to see how they're doing? What's the typical timeline of a graduate student to graduate? And this is usually written by the program director or department chair. And the aim is, this was going back to what I showed you at the beginning, this document on the biomedical workforce is to reduce the length of graduate training. This section is not yet required for fellowships. I just thought I would tell you that. I wanted to also highlight this other section on another page called Facilities and Other Resources. This section does not have a page limit, so many times you can add information here that you wouldn't be able to add in the other sections, which have very strict page limits. And you could talk about in more detail all of the resources in your mentor's lab or any core facilities at your institution that are relevant to the research that you're proposing. You can make another section called Career Development Resources and talk more about the different programs that you're going to go to in terms of career development, maybe offered by your Office of Graduate Affairs, or the postdoc office also offers it, maybe your department offers it, or maybe when you go to a national meeting, your professional society also offers programming for junior investigators. You can talk about any courses you're going to take, or workshops, or webinars, or so forth. Like this webinar would be perfect to describe in any fellowship application. And this way, in this section, you don't have to worry about space too much because there's no page limit. Other attachments. For those that are filling out the F31 for diversity candidates, there's another document that needs to be added, and it's just an institutional letter certifying that the individual is eligible to apply for the diversity fellowship. Many times you would get the letter from your Office of Graduate Affairs or your sponsored projects or grants office, and it just needs to be on institutional letterhead. It's really just an eligibility letter. Cover letter. Now, you need to also a requirement to include a cover letter, and one of the reasons is that you need to say who your list of referees will be, because F31 applications also require 3 to 5 confidential letters of references. These are not included with the application. You never see them, but they're submitted electronically individually by the individual that's submitting this letter of reference. 3 to 5. I recommend 4. And these would be from individuals who know you well, and know you from a scientific perspective. It could be somebody on your thesis committee. It could be one of your advisors. It could be somebody from undergraduate that you did a research project with. It cannot be your mentor or somebody else in the main body of the application. And they should talk about how they know you, whether it was a research experience, your successes in that research experience, and how they feel that you will continue to be a success in the scientific workforce. Just to give you a heads up, as I sort of did earlier, that there's going to be in the near future required training in rigor and reproducibility. And so to look for that when you're completing your applications in the future. It's not a requirement right now, but as you can see, NIH has given us advance notice of that. I've just included all the sort of reference points on the NIH webpage to help you find all this information, because it's a very large webpage and it would be very difficult to find this information. So in the closing minutes, general approaches for competitive grant applications. So one of the things I feel folks don't do is to take enough time before they begin to write the grant application is to think about what would make the grant application more competitive. It's not the will to win, but the will to prepare to win that makes the difference. So what are some of the things to think about before you start to write the application? Well, talk to the program officer at NIH. Talk to colleagues who received similar applications. Ask, if possible, to look at their successful F31 application. Read the review criteria over and over again, and think about what would make the application more competitive. Is there a core facility that should be involved? Is there somebody else as an advisor who has an expertise that's lacking elsewhere? Is there any preliminary data or pilot data or whatever you want to call it that will strengthen the application? Think about who's going to be those 3 to 5 individuals that are going to write those confidential letters. Perhaps you should have more than one mentor, called co-mentoring. Think about that. What are the other collaborators and co-investigators who should be involved? How can you make the grant multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary? And then as you get closer to writing the grant, begin to meet with all of the individuals, your advisors, the co-mentors, directors of the core facilities. There's always research administrators at institutions and so forth. Think about if there's any regulatory issues if you're using human subjects or laboratory animals. And then finally, complete the grant application. Read the instructions more than once. All right. Identify all the different components that need to be completed. I would suggest having a checklist, and not only having a checklist of all the items to be completed, but also a timeline of when you hope or should have that item completed. Create an outline, and not only an outline listing the different content areas, if you will, but how long should each section be? This section's a paragraph, this section's a page and a half. Practically every section has very strict page limits you don't want to go over. Think about who might have responsibility beyond you for all the different sections. There's an administrator that will work on the budget. Maybe your mentor will help draft some of the letters and so forth. Keep in mind the page limits. Create a schedule for yourself of when you're going to meet with individuals. These are just sort of technical areas of what font are you going to use and so forth. You're going to be collecting sections from different people. Just make sure that everything can go together. Make sure you set a firm timeline for completing all of these different sections. Read the instructions. I can't say it more than once. Never assume that the reviewers know what you mean. It's not your PhD defense. They're not going to be in the room with you. If it's important for them to know it, tell it to them. If it's important in more than one section, it's okay to say it in more than one section. They might not review the grant all the way through, so they might not have remembered what you said 5 pages before, because in fact that was 2 weeks earlier. Refer to the literature thoroughly and thoughtfully. You want to demonstrate to them that you know exactly where this field is and how your work is going to advance the field. You would do that by referring to the literature thoroughly and thoughtfully. Explicitly state the rationale of the project. As I said, the hypothesis of my study is. Mentioned this before. Discuss any areas or challenges and how you would address it. It demonstrates tremendous maturity on your part. It's always important, I think, helpful to include tables and figures. Imagine the reviewers reading page after page of text. If something can be represented in a table or a figure, then do it. Remember, start with an outline so that what you're presenting comes off in a very organized fashion. And always ask colleagues or friends to review the grant and to offer comments. So you have to give it to them not the day before, because you want to give them time to read it and to make good comments, and then you need to give yourself time to implement any of the changes that they suggest. With regard to tables and figures, think about how to make it as readable as possible for the reviewers. Make sure the figure caption and the figure are together. Okay, not that there's a figure on one page and the description of the figure is 2 pages later. Don't make the figure too complicated. They should be able to sort of look at the figure and understand the point that you're trying to make. Many times some reviewers are still printing out grant applications to read them, and they take it with them on the plane or whatever, and they're not many times printing them in color. So make sure that great picture of cells doesn't come out to be a gray smear when they print it, or that the lines, the pink line and the red line, don't look any different when it's printed in black and white. And make sure that it's easy for the reviewers to read, that it's not too small font that they really can't tell what's going on. It's got to be informative. Maybe put in a timeline like this in terms of your project, relating it to the specific aims. So here's an example of a 3-year fellowship, and you're sort of laid out the progress of the project over the 3-year period. I just did it in sort of 6-month intervals, if you will. But if you do something like this, it also demonstrates to the reviewers a lot of maturity when you've thought things through at such a level. Remember, you're not in the room with the reviewers, so think of every possible question that they could have, even if it's obvious to you, and answer the questions in the text. Because if they have an outstanding question that's not addressed, you probably won't get as good a score than if you totally covered everything that they could possibly have a question about. 7 bullet point elements of a good proposal. As a junior investigator, you want to come off as competent, enthusiastic, thorough, and professional. And it really will come through in your personal statement. I've read hundreds of them, and believe it or not, even though they're a few pages long, you really feel like you know the individual and their enthusiasm and their commitment to science and research at the end of those couple of pages. So what are some common problems with grant applications from new investigators? It doesn't address the particular funding program or funding mechanism or the agency or the amount of money that's available or the timeline. It's a 3-year fellowship and the project is 5 years long. That's not a good fit. This is very common. It's overly ambitious. It's proposing too much for the resources and the time that's available. You want to sort of show near the end that you're becoming more independent at the end of the fellowship. It can't be a fishing expedition where you just sort of do a bunch of experiments, you look for some outlying points, and then you figure out why they're outlying points, as opposed to having a hypothesis-driven project. You're asking a question, and then you're answering the question. Also, you want to make it mechanistic. You want to not just be collecting data, but trying to understand why something is happening. You don't want it to be unfocused. Well, the research projects, they're all involved, they're all related to diabetes, but they're not tied together by a common theme or a common hypothesis. I think it always helps to have preliminary or pilot data. It shows the feasibility of the project as well as demonstrates that you're able to do the project. The budget or your mentor's research funds have to match what's proposed, and if the methodologies are beyond the expertise of you and your mentor, then bring in collaborators and co-investigators. It's good if a project is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. So bring in colleagues that have the appropriate expertise. So one summer, I worked at a study section at NIH, and this is when the grants were still in hard copy form, and I asked to see the mailroom, and the mailroom was sort of the world's biggest copy machines and piles of FedEx boxes and so forth. And I think even though grants are now electronic, I think it sort of demonstrates the fact that there is a lot of competition out there. And in fact, your grant application is, in fact, let's say all the way back there, and you've got to make your grant sort of stand out head and shoulders above all the rest. So this is my sort of little cartoon about this. And to realize that reviewers don't get all these grants, don't go into their office and pull down the shades and lock the door and have now dedicated the next 4 hours of their life to reading your grant. In fact, it's a lot of work, and they have a lot of grants, and they have to somehow differentiate all of these grants. So this is my sort of schematic representation of grants. So there are some grants that are just absolutely great and will definitely get funded, and then some not so great, and they probably won't get funded. But the vast majority of the grants are in the middle, and they're fine. And if there was unlimited amount of money, they would all get funded because they're fine. But there isn't an unlimited amount of money. So it's just human nature for what the reviewers do. For all these fine grants is they have to somehow find something wrong with them. So for instance, these grants didn't address rigor and reproducibility and had very poor study design or statistical analysis, so they're gone. And maybe these grants, involved some unique cell line or transgenic animal line and didn't discuss where they were getting this research resource from. So they're gone. Or as a fellowship should have a very strong career development plan, seminars and webinars and workshops and so forth, and these grants did not do it. And then there are these grants where the reviewer really couldn't make out what was going on in the figures just because the figure captions were so small, and they really couldn't understand what was going on, so they lost the point of these great figures. So those applications are gone. So in the end, you want to be like the sort of the last person standing, if you will, because you've done everything possible to make the application as strong as possible. And so finally, good luck. And I hope this information, I know it was a lot of information, but I hope this information was informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin.
Okay,
at this point, we will be opening up for our question and answer portion of
okay, great. I look forward to it.
The series. We have one hand raised, and we have received a couple of questions in written format. I will be with a question that came in written format during the presentation.
Okay.
And this is a question from Lindsay, who asks, who says, I am working under a newer faculty member. Mm-hmm. She has only 2 other students. Will this negatively affect my application with regard to my mentor's history?
So, Lindsay, that's a great question, and I've heard it frequently, where someone has a new faculty member who's probably great and doing really exciting research, but doesn't have a track record of being a mentor himself or herself just because they're starting out. And so many times what folks do in such a case is to have a mentor, a co-mentor, a more senior faculty member who's in a related or complementary area of research who will also mentor you. And this more senior faculty member will have a longer track record of mentoring students and postdocs and launching students into the postdoc stage. So there you have the benefit of a junior faculty member and a more senior faculty member, and this usually works very well. I hope that answers that question.
All right, our next question, we have a question from Fatima, who has submitted a question via, who has her hand raised. So Fatima, we will in fact unmute you so that you may ask your question verbally. I see it in the chat as well. So we'll confirm. All right, Fatima, you.
Thank you.
Yes.
So what are the chances for international students to get NIH fellowship funds?
The F31, one needs to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident to be eligible. But there are other funding mechanisms, other funding non-government agencies where citizenship is not an eligibility criteria. So, for instance, the American Heart Association has a pre-doc fellowship, and students on visas, and I was a graduate student on a visa, are eligible to apply. And the general concepts that I discussed earlier in terms of what makes a competitive application are appropriate for all of these types of agencies, realizing that faculty who are peer reviewers for NIH are also peer reviewers for the American Heart Association or whatever. But in terms of the NIH Fellowship F31, one needs to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. So one needs to think about other funding agencies.
Thank you.
Okay, good luck.
All right, we will move on to the next raised hand question from Nancy.
Okay.
And Nancy, I'll let you know when you're on the air. You are on the air.
Okay, thank you. I actually submitted mine as well. At what point in the doctoral program should students apply? I'm assuming this would be before they receive candidacy.
So one obviously needs to have chosen a mentor. I think to have a good amount of preliminary data. I think perhaps as one is just sort of past one's qualifying exams, if that sort of makes sense for your graduate program, because I think at that point you have a well-defined project that you can discuss in the application. Does that make sense for your graduate program?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, okay, good. Because different graduate programs will use different terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. So our next question, let me just make sure all hands raised have been answered, but we have a couple of questions in the chat.
All great questions.
This is sort of a housekeeping one. So Asan asks whether we will have these slides available online. So we will be following up with all of you who are in attendance to share the video from today's session, and we'll also be posting the full recorded session online on our website, nrmnet.net. We can certainly, if Dr. Rubin is amenable to it, share the actual slide deck as well,
right.
But
sure.
I leave that to you.
No, I certainly will, and I also post all of my slides on my I have a course on funding and grantsmanship, and I post all the slides up there, and I certainly plan on doing that too.
Wonderful. Perhaps we'll circulate that URL to folks as well.
Okay.
Great. And the next question we had here was already answered. That was our question about international student eligibility. The next question here comes from Vasti. Vasti is recently had a shift from being a master's student to now being a PhD student, causing Vasti to fall behind in schedule and is now a fourth-year student. Would this impact Vasti's application negatively in a significant manner?
Well, I think one should still apply at the same stage when one has a mentor and a research project, and perhaps passing the qualifying exams or the equivalent that you have at your school. But you know, there are different parts in the application where you can sort of tell your story, and so there are, you know, non-traditional paths through graduate school, and I have worked with such students. So there's your personal statement, there's a part of your bio sketch where, you know, if there were sort of non-traditional paths through graduate school, then just explain them. And then also have others explain it if you're not comfortable doing it. There's the statement from your mentor. There are letters from advisors or the confidential letters that I mentioned. So there are different points in the application. It's a very personal application. It's very different than a research grant where you can sort of discuss, you know, different aspects of your life and your path through graduate school and how you got to this point in your career. So even if it took a little bit longer, you just need to explain what happened. Hello?
Yes, so
okay.
Just looking.
I just wanted to make sure you were still there.
Yes, I am. So let's see here. I believe at this point we have gone through all of our written in questions and hands no longer raised. We do have a hearty thank you from both Asan and from Vasti for those responses.
Okay.
Looking at the time, Attendees, we do have plenty of time for additional questions, so no need to be shy. If you do have one that you've been considering submitting, feel free to raise your hand or use the questions section to submit a written question.
Right. While folks are formulating questions, let me just say that that the skills that you gain in writing an F31 or any fellowship application are skills that you will take with you forever in your research career. You'll be writing grants as a faculty member, and a lot of the points that I've mentioned in terms of organizing the application and approaching the different sections are sort of universal, and the skill sets that you gain here you will take with you. And when you become a faculty member, having had this experience, it'll make it a little bit easier as when you begin to write that first research grant.
Hey, Drew. We'll just leave a few more minutes for folks to submit any final questions.
Sure.
If none, we will go ahead and adjourn, but looking for any additional hands raised or questions in the chat. Yes, we have one.
Okay, all right, great.
So Liz asks via written question, do previous unsuccessful submissions of a fellowship grant by your mentor for a different grad student negatively impact future submissions?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely not. The reviewers probably have no idea unless they happen to be on the same panel. It has no impact. The application is really about you. And so the reviewers don't have an idea. I will say, and I did mention that in the NIH world, you sort of get two chances to submit the grant application. You submit an initial application. You will get comments back on each of the different sections that I went through from usually up to 3 reviewers. And then if you didn't get a fundable score, you then get to resubmit the grant addressing the comments of the reviewers in that initial round. You need to address all of the comments, and usually when folks comprehensively and adequately address the reviewer's comments, they usually get a much better score the second time. So it's just not a one-shot deal. In fact, you can submit the grant twice. And it's very important to read those reviewers' comments back and then to address them in the resubmission grant. But previous applications by your mentor should have no impact on your application. So that was a good question.
And we have received a couple more.
Okay.
So Dylan says, I haven't definitively decided on academia as a career path. Would this be a detriment to my application?
I think NIH and the reviewers, realizing that the reviewers are all NIH-funded investigators from around the country, so it's probably to your advantage. This is who they're hoping to. Even though there's talk now of telling graduate students about alternate careers in government and publishing and industry and so forth, realizing that the reviewers are all NIH-funded academic scientists. The reviewers are not from these alternate worlds. I hope that addresses that question.
And just as a clarifying question to that, would you then, Dr. Rubin, say that Dylan listing or indicating that he's undecided about pursuing academia as a career path would be in fact helpful because the reviewers want to encourage this person to take that path, or would be a detriment?
Well, there is a lot of talk now about giving graduate students information about alternate careers. But I don't think we're quite at that point where it's been incorporated into these fellowship applications.
Okay.
So I think there is this sort of expectation that they'll continue in academics.
That makes sense. All right, we have one next question. Elizabeth asks, should career aspirations be fairly limited to within academia? I suppose this amounts to a similar question. Can they be outside of academia? You may have just sort of answered that by your last response.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's more and more interest or in informing students about other things that they can do with a doctoral degree in the biomedical sciences. But I don't think that's filtered down to the fellowship, realizing that the reviewers have chosen careers in academic research. And have been successful at it. So it's not like anybody from industry or government affairs, government policy is sitting on the review committee. They're all academic scientists.
All right, looking through, we do not have, oh, pardon me, we have just received several more.
Okay, great.
Liz, thanks you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for your question.
Elizabeth would like to make her question perhaps a little bit more specific, saying perhaps say in law school, but also says that your response has been helpful thus far.
Okay, good.
All right, and we do have one additional question from Emily.
Hi,
asking,
Emily.
is it more important to identify specific experimental techniques to be learned or cite more general skills such as presentations, manuscript writing, etc.?
So I think both categories are important. So in terms of the research skills, that would be sort of in the research component part of the application. And then the other is the career development skills, writing grants, writing journal articles, giving presentations. Those are also very important skill sets that academic scientists might have. So it's not an either or, it's in fact both. So, many times when folks write these kinds of grants, they sort of focus on the technical aspect, learning this particular skill, learning how to run that piece of equipment and so forth. It's just sort of human nature to focus on that part, but realizing that this is, a fellowship to support somebody who is going to be a faculty member, not a technician. So also about learning the sort of intellectual aspect of this, learning how to design experiments, learning how to ask questions, learning how to answer the questions. So it's also the sort of intellectual aspect of the research, even though biology is so technology driven and whether you have good hands in the lab and so forth, but try not to focus too much on the technical aspect of it. But the research aspect and the career development aspect are both important.
All right, our next question here, we have a clarifying question from Asan asking, so if my career aspirations are outside of academia and I state these, will these hurt my chances of obtaining an F grant?
I can't answer that question definitively, but the mission of the program is to sort of support folks at this stage of their career as they transition from postdoc to assistant professor. And if you read the review criteria, you'll see that sort of mission coming through.
We have a next question from Jordan, who asks, is this fellowship an option for students with less than 1 to 2 years remaining in their degree program? Or are there other fellowship options that may be a better fit?
Right. So if you have 1 to 2 years left, this is probably not the best funding program because, as I said at the beginning, it takes about 9 months from application to award. So by that time, you'll be sort of on the verge of graduating, if you will. So it's probably not somebody with just, 1 year left, or you'll probably get the award as you're sort of finishing up, and so thus it probably wouldn't be a successful application. You would have to look for specific funding programs that are for the most senior students. NCI just recently announced a program, a transition funding program. I haven't seen it from anybody else, which was for a senior graduate student, and so it supported the sort of final years of graduate school and then the beginning years of postdoc. I've only seen that from NCI, so it'll be interesting to see if the other institutes also fund that transition funding mechanism. So this is definitely something to think about as you're sort of nearing the qualifying exam stage.
And looking through, we have no further questions in the queue. We do have several more minutes. If anyone would like to submit any additional questions, either via the chat or again, you can raise your hand using the hand raising function and we can unmute you to ask your question verbally. We'll just pause for a moment and await any last questions.
I will say that I'm going to post these slides up on my grants course webpage, so they should be there in a couple of days.
We do have another question.
Okay, great.
Maxwell asks,
Hi, Maxwell.
My program only takes 3 years and I'm just starting, but I'll only have 2 years left once I finish my qualifying exam. According to your previous answer, does that mean I should be looking elsewhere?
So your graduate program is only 3 years long? Oh, that's great, or 3 years from the qualifying exam. I mean, perhaps if you submitted it right around the time, you could perhaps submit a grant asking for 2 years of funding. Or, you could ask for 3 years, and if you're not there, then if you graduate beforehand, then the money's sort of not lost, if you will. The grant would just have been ended early because you had graduated and moved on.
The field is epidemiology. I'm not sure if that's...
Okay. Right. So, I mean, one could ask for, more time, and then if you graduate, then the grant would just be ended in midstream of the last year, if you will. I hope that answers the question. It's fine to graduate before the grant ends. Your institution would just end the grant, when you've left and notify NIH.
And we're still open for questions. We'll just wait another moment and await any pending questions being composed. And well, at this time, seeing no additional questions,
Okay.
this may be a good time for us to thank you all for tuning in. And
Yes, thank you all.
thank you, Dr. Rubin, for this wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful and informative.
We will be following up, just as a reminder, to share the recording of the presentation with everyone, as well as the link to Dr. Rubin's site where she will be hosting the slides. And for those of you who are interested, please join us for future NRMN career development webinars. We actually have one tomorrow about co-creating a healthcare system that works for everyone. So for those of you who may be interested or know someone who may be interested, there is an opportunity to tune in with us again tomorrow afternoon. Find out more at nrmnet.net online. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Okay, thanks for all the participants.